My name is Evan Caldwell. I was 36 that fall, and I'd spent most of my adult life convincing myself that motion was the cure for everything that stayed broken when you stood still. I was traveling with my partner, Mara, in a 1991 Volkswagen Vanagon we'd rebuilt with our own hands. New seals, rewired cabinets, insulation layered like a promise against the cold. We called it Solace, half as a joke, half because naming something gives you the illusion it can live up to it. Northern Nevada in September of 2022 was supposed to be a pause, not a destination, just a place to sleep between Oregon and Utah, somewhere empty enough to reset our breathing. The map showed a state campground far from highways, far from cell service, far from anything that asked questions. The reviews were old, scattered, and vague, words like quiet, windswept, closed early in the season sometimes. But there was a note, repeated just often enough to feel reassuring. If you arrive late, there's usually one site left. We arrived later than planned. Dusk was already stretching the desert thin, that bruised purple color that feels less like night arriving and more like the land exhaling. The entrance sign was sun-bleached, letters flaking, the campground name almost illegible. The gate stood open but not welcoming, more like it had been forgotten in the position it was last left. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Not sage, not dust. Something older. Metallic, faintly sweet, like rain that never quite hit the ground. Mara noticed it too. She wrinkled her nose and asked if something had died nearby. I told her it was probably the van heating up after the long drive. It was easier than admitting the smell felt intentional, like a warning laid down hours before we arrived. We rolled past empty loops, campsites stripped bare, fire rings cold, picnic tables flipped upside down as if a storm had passed through and lost interest halfway. No tents, no RVs. No sound except wind whirring the scrub brush and the soft, uneven hum of our engine echoing too loudly in the absence of anything else. Then, just as the last light slipped behind the hills, we saw the ranger station, a single-story structure, windows dark, but the porch light was on. That small detail calmed me more than it should have. Light meant routine. Light meant someone cared enough to flip a switch. I parked the van and stepped out, boots crunching on gravel that sounded amplified, like the ground itself was listening. The ranger stepped onto the porch before I reached the door. He was older, late 60s, maybe 70s, with a hat that had once been official but now slumped under its own history. His uniform didn't quite match itself. Patches faded to different eras. His smile was polite but strained, like it had been practiced in isolation. "Evening," he said. "You're cutting it close." I apologized, explained the delay, told him we were just looking for a single night. He nodded slowly, as if the idea of time arriving late was familiar to him. "Lucky for you," he said, turning toward the station. "You're the last ones tonight. Only one site still open." Inside, the station smelled worse than outside. Paper rot, old coffee, that same metallic sweetness threaded through it all. The desk was cluttered, but not actively used, forms stacked in uneven piles, a calendar on the wall still turned to April. I noticed that and felt a flicker of discomfort I couldn't name. He asked for my name, wrote it down carefully, each letter deliberate. When he asked for payment, I reached for my wallet, but he waved it off. "Settle up in the morning," he said, "if you're still around." The way he said it, "if," caught in my chest. I laughed too loud, and he didn't join me. He handed me a paper map, edges soft with age. He circled a site near the far loop, his pen pressing hard enough to tear the page. "Stay on the road," he said. "Don't wander after dark. Sounds carry strangely out here." Mara asked him if there were animals we should worry about. He hesitated, then nodded once. "Some things don't belong to anyone," he said, and left it at that. As we drove toward the site, the temperature dropped fast. Desert cold isn't gradual, it collapses. I could feel it through the van's thin doors, the chill pressing in like hands testing for weak points. The headlights carved narrow tunnels through the dark, revealing nothing beyond what we were already committed to hitting. Our site sat at the edge of a dry wash. No neighbors, no lights. Just us and the wind in a sky so full of stars it felt invasive, like being watched by 1,000 unblinking eyes. We parked, shut off the engine, and the sudden silence rang louder than the drive had. That's when the sound started. Not immediately. It crept in after we'd settled, after Mara had lit the small propane stove and the van filled with the comforting hiss of routine. A rhythmic tapping, soft, irregular, like someone knocking without hands. I told myself it was branches, then rocks shifting as the temperature changed, then maybe an animal curious about food. Each explanation lasted only as long as it took for the sound to repeat in a way that contradicted it. 3 taps. Pause. 2 taps. Pause. 1. Mara stopped moving. The stove flame wavered. "Do you hear that?" she asked. I said yes, but what I meant was I don't want to. The tapping moved. Not closer. Not farther. Just different, as if whatever made it had circled us without approaching. I stepped outside with a flashlight, my breath fogging instantly, the beam cutting through nothing. The smell was stronger now, clinging to the cold. "Probably a horse," I called back, though I hadn't seen any sign of them. My voice sounded wrong out there, flattened, swallowed. When I turned back toward the van, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. Footprints. Not human, not animal in any way I recognized. Too wide at the heel, too shallow, pressed into the dust as if the ground hadn't fully accepted them. I didn't tell Mara. That night, sleep came in fragments. Each time I drifted off, the sound returned, not tapping now, but something like breathing. Slow, measured, patient. At one point, I was sure I heard my name spoken softly outside the van. I told myself it was the wind shaping syllables out of chance. Morning arrived without ceremony. Pale light revealed nothing new, which felt worse than if it had. The footprints were gone. The smell lingered. Mara said she felt watched all night, like the dark had weight. We decided to check out early. When we returned to the ranger station, the porch light was off. The door was locked. A new sign hung crookedly on the window. Closed, season ended 2018. I stood there longer than necessary, reading it again and again, waiting for the meaning to change. Behind us, the wind picked up, carrying with it the faint sound of tapping. 3, then 2, then 1. I stood there staring at the sign until the words stopped behaving like language and became shapes instead. Black paint cracking on glass, a message left behind by someone who assumed no one would argue with it. Closed. Season ended 2018. The year pressed against my chest harder than the cold had the night before. 4 years wasn't a clerical error. 4 years was abandonment. Mara came up beside me, read it once, then again. She didn't say anything at first. She has always been slower with fear than I am. Not braver, just more careful about letting it exist. "Maybe they forgot to take the sign down," she said finally. I nodded too fast. That answer was easy. That answer meant the man we'd spoken to had a pulse, a paycheck, a reason to be there. It meant the smell had a source. It meant the sounds had explanations that would hold if pressed hard enough. But when I tried the door one more time, my hand brushed against something that made my stomach turn. Dust. Thick, undisturbed. The handle hadn't been touched in a long time. Inside the station, through the glass, everything was exactly as we'd seen it the night before. Papers stacked, calendars still turned to April. But now I noticed something I hadn't under artificial light. Spider webs stretched between the desk legs and the wall, dense enough to sag. The coffee cup on the desk had dried to a blackened ring years ago. Mara followed my gaze. Her face tightened, not with panic yet, but with suspicion. The kind that asks questions your mouth refuses to. "Evan," she said quietly, "how did he turn the porch light on?" The wind answered before I could. It came rushing down from the hills, sudden and forceful, rattling the flagpole beside the station. There was no flag attached, just the sound of metal striking metal again and again, like with a rhythm too close to the tapping from the night before. I told her maybe it was solar-powered. I told her maybe someone came by to maintain the building once in a while. I told her anything that kept us from saying the obvious thing out loud, that we had spoken to someone who, by all evidence, could not have been there. We got back in the van without checking out, without settling up. As I turned the key, the engine hesitated, just long enough to remind me how alone we were. When it finally caught, relief washed through me, so hard it felt like vertigo. We drove out slowly, eyes scanning the empty loops. In daylight, the campground looked less threatening but more wrong. Fire rings rusted through. Informational signs sun-bleached to illegibility. The road itself was cracked and buckled, weeds forcing their way through asphalt that hadn't been cared for in years. At the edge of the property, just before the road curved out of sight of the station, Mara told me to stop. "There," she said, pointing. A small wooden post stood half buried in the dirt, a site marker. The number carved into it was the same one the ranger had circled on our map. Below it, carved deeper, rougher, were words that hadn't been there on the paper. Last site open. The letters looked recent, fresh cuts in old wood. My mouth went dry. Someone's messing with us, I said, though the sentence felt thin even as it left me. Mara didn't argue. She just took a picture with her phone, then checked for signal out of habit. There was none, not even the ghost of a bar. As we pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a moment, just a moment, I thought I saw someone standing on the ranger station porch, watching us leave. When I looked again, there was only shadow. We didn't talk much as the road stretched on. The desert swallowed sound the way deep water does, efficiently, without drama. The farther we got, the more I expected the unease to lift. Instead, it settled deeper, like a weight shifting into a more comfortable position. An hour later, the smell returned. Inside the van this time. Metallic, sweet, familiar. Mara noticed it too. She opened a window despite the cold. The smell didn't thin. It felt embedded, as if the van itself had absorbed it overnight and was now breathing it back at us. That was when the radio turned on. We hadn't used it since before Oregon. The knob was broken, stuck between stations, but now static crackled through the speakers, rising and falling like surf. Then, beneath it, a voice. Not clear, not distorted enough to dismiss. Sight still open. Mara reached for the knob, twisting it hard. The static spiked, then cut out completely. Silence returned, heavier than before. "Did you hear?" she started. "I heard it," I said. We drove faster. By mid-afternoon, we reached a small town. 3 streets, a gas station, a diner that looked permanently closed. Relief hit me so suddenly my hands shook. People meant witnesses. People meant rules. At the gas station, an older woman behind the counter watched us with mild curiosity as I paid. She had the look of someone who'd lived in the same place long enough to see patterns repeat. "Camp up north?" she asked casually. "Yeah," I said. "The state campground off the..." She stopped smiling. "That place been shut down a long time," she said. "Why?" I hesitated. "We checked in last night." Her eyes narrowed, not in disbelief, but in recognition. "You talked to a man?" she asked. "Older." "Wore a hat?" The room seemed to tilt. "Yes," Mara said. "You know him?" The woman sighed, leaned back against the counter. "My father worked that campground," she said, "right up until it closed. That ranger died on duty. Heart gave out. That was..." She paused, thinking. "Had to be 2018. I felt something inside me unravel quietly, like a knot finally giving way. He used to say," she continued, "that place didn't like being empty, that it kept people longer than it should. Folks would show up thinking it was still open. Stay a night, sometimes more." "What happened to them?" Mara asked. The woman met her gaze evenly. "Some left," she said. "Different than when they arrived, that some didn't. We left without another word. As the sun dropped again, the sky bruised the same way it had the night before. I kept driving long after fatigue set in, afraid of stopping anywhere that didn't have lights, people, noise. But the road grew emptier, the towns farther apart. When the van finally sputtered, fuel gauge lying to me in that familiar betraying way, I pulled over onto a dirt turnout, hands trembling. "We'll just sleep a few hours," I said. "First light. We're gone." Mara didn't answer. She was staring out the window. "There's tapping," she whispered. I listened. 3 taps. Pause. 2 taps. Pause. 1. Not outside. Inside the van. From the cabinets we'd rebuilt ourselves, from the walls that had carried us across half the country, from the place we'd named Solace as if names could protect us. I felt the cold then, not from the desert, but from the understanding settling into my bones. Whatever we'd met hadn't stayed behind. It had checked in with us. The tapping didn't stop when I turned the engine back on. It matched the vibration of the van at first, almost politely, as if adjusting itself to our movement. I told myself it was loose paneling, something shifting after a night in the cold. I told myself anything that let me keep my hands on the wheel without shaking them apart. Mara sat rigid in the passenger seat, eyes fixed forward, counting under her breath. I didn't need to ask what she was counting. The rhythm had etched itself into both of us now. 3. Pause. 2. Pause. 1. When I accelerated, it sped up. When I slowed, it waited. That's when denial finally failed me. Not collapsed. Failed. Quietly. Like a lock you keep turning even after the key snaps off inside it. We drove until the road narrowed into nothing more than suggestion, until the headlights picked out dust and scrub and the occasional reflective eyes that vanished the second you focused on them. The fuel light glowed steadily now, a small, rational problem trying to compete with an irrational one. "Evan," Mara said, her voice steady, in a way that scared me more than panic would have. "It knows us." I didn't ask what it was. Naming gives shape, and shape gives power. Whatever had checked us in at that campground didn't need either. The smell grew stronger as night deepened. Not rotten, not sharp, just present, like blood diluted in water, like rain hitting rust. It coated the inside of my nose, settled on my tongue. Breathing felt like participating in something I hadn't agreed to. We finally saw lights ahead. An isolated rest stop perched above a shallow ravine. A handful of parked semis. A bathroom block humming with fluorescent insistence. Civilization in its barest form, but enough. I pulled in fast, killed the engine, and for one blessed second, the tapping stopped. The silence rang. "Stay in the van," I told Mara. She nodded, but her eyes followed me as I stepped out, as if she wasn't sure I'd make it back. The cold hit harder here, amplified by elevation. My breath came out in ragged clouds as I walked toward the bathroom building, boots echoing too loudly on concrete. Halfway there, I felt it. That pressure, the sensation of being observed, not from a direction, but from around, like the air itself had narrowed its attention. I didn't look back. Inside the bathroom, the lights flickered. The smell was worse here, chemical cleaner failing to mask something organic beneath it. I splashed water on my face, gripping the sink hard enough to whiten my knuckles. In the mirror, I looked older than I had that morning. Not tired, thinned, as if something had skimmed off the surface of me. A sound came from the far stall. 3 taps. Pause. 2. Pause. 1. My throat closed. I backed away from the mirror, heart hammering so hard it blurred my vision. I told myself someone else was in here. A trucker, a traveler. Anyone who could explain why the rhythm had followed me off the road and into tile and plumbing. "Occupied," a voice said softly. It was the ranger's voice, not loud, not threatening, familiar in the worst way. I ran. I don't remember my feet hitting the ground between the building and the van. I don't remember opening the door. I only remember Mara's hands on my arms, grounding me, anchoring me to the present. "It's here," I said. "It's not staying in one place." She nodded once, like she'd already accepted that truth. We didn't sleep. We sat there, engine running, watching the dark press against the limits of the headlights. Once, I thought I saw a figure near the bathroom door. Hat brim. Stillness. But when a semi pulled out, its headlights washed the scene clean, leaving nothing behind. Just before dawn, the tapping returned. Not rhythmic this time, impatient. The van shuddered as if something heavy leaned against it. Cabinets rattled. The smell surged, thick enough to make my eyes water. Mara grabbed my hand, nails biting into my skin. "I don't want to disappear here," she said, voice breaking for the first time. Something scraped along the side of the van. Slow, deliberate, like a finger dragging across dust. "Last sight open," the voice murmured from everywhere and nowhere. Still room. I did the only thing that felt defiant enough to matter. I turned the headlights off. The darkness slammed down, absolute and immediate. Mara gasped, but I held firm. In the sudden absence of light, the pressure changed. The scraping stopped. The smell receded, just a fraction. "I think it needs us to see it," I whispered, to agree it's there. The silence stretched. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure it would give us away. Then, slowly, the pressure lifted. The tapping faded, dissolving into the wind. When I turned the headlights back on, there was nothing beside us. No footprints. No marks. Just the ordinary emptiness of a place people passed through and forgot. At sunrise, we left. We drove until the van coughed one last time and coasted into a town with a real name and a working gas pump. We didn't tell anyone the full story. We didn't need to. Some things lose power when spoken aloud, but others only learn how to travel. Weeks later, after we'd sold the Vanagon, after we'd tried to return to something like normal, a package arrived at our new apartment. No return address. Inside was a paper map, edges soft, a single site circled in red. On the back, in handwriting I recognized too well, were 3 words carved deep enough to tear the paper. Still open. I think about that campground sometimes, about places that don't close when we say they do. About how motion isn't always escape, sometimes it's invitation. And when I lie awake at night, listening to the building settle, counting the sounds it makes, I stop at 3. I never go on to 2. I never learned whether selling the van was an ending or a compromise. At the time, it felt like survival, like cutting off a limb that had gone numb before the numbness reached the heart. Mara said she couldn't sit inside it anymore without feeling like the walls were listening. I didn't argue. I'd started parking it farther from the apartment each night, checking the windows before bed, catching myself counting the sounds of the building the way I once counted the taps in the desert. 3 was safety. 3 meant nothing else followed. Life, on the surface, went on. Jobs, groceries, conversations about weather and plans and all the small things people use to prove the world is stable. But something in me had shifted permanently, like a compass needle that no longer points north but insists it's still correct. Because the truth I didn't want to admit, the truth that still wakes me some nights, is this: the campground didn't chase us. It invited us. That realization came slowly, not with panic, but with a creeping sense of responsibility. I replayed the moment at the ranger station again and again. The way the man had smiled, the way he'd said, "If you're still around," the way he hadn't taken payment as if money had stopped meaning anything to him a long time ago. He hadn't trapped us. He'd offered us continuity. I started researching after the map arrived, not obsessively at first, casually, the way you Google a bad dream just to prove it's common. I found forums half abandoned, posts that ended mid-sentence, threads where people described arriving at campgrounds that shouldn't exist anymore. Always remote, always just off a road people stopped checking, always with a figure who seemed to belong there more than anyone else. A caretaker, a keeper, a ranger. The details changed. The rhythm didn't. 3 taps came up more than once. So did the smell. So did the phrase "last sight open," sometimes written, sometimes spoken, sometimes remembered without knowing where it came from. What stayed with me most was the pattern of who got away. It wasn't the strongest or the smartest. It wasn't even the most cautious. It was the people who hesitated at the edge, who felt the wrongness early and didn't argue with it. The ones who turned off lights, who stopped looking for proof, who accepted uncertainty without trying to own it. People who didn't need answers. I wasn't one of them. Not at first. For a long time, I treated the experience like something that had happened to me. Like weather, like bad luck. Something external I could outrun if I stayed alert enough, rational enough, loud enough in my own head. But the desert doesn't work that way. The desert teaches by subtraction. It takes away landmarks, sound, certainty, until all that's left is how well you listen when nothing is speaking directly to you. That's the lesson the campground left me with. Not that the world is dangerous, though it is. Not that solitude invites monsters, though sometimes it does. The lesson is quieter and harder to live with. Some places don't want witnesses. They want residents. The ranger wasn't lying to us. He really did have one site left. What he didn't say, what he maybe couldn't say anymore, was what staying meant. That if we'd stayed another night, the rhythm would have settled into us fully. That the van would have stopped feeling like ours. That the smell would have faded, not because it left, but because we'd stopped noticing it. That's how places like that survive. Not by force, by familiarity. Mara left before winter. She said she needed a city, noise, elevators, neighbors close enough to hear through walls. I didn't try to stop her. Love doesn't always survive the same truths, and I couldn't ask her to carry something she hadn't invited. I moved farther inland. No deserts, no wide open anything. I chose places with too many exits, too many voices. Still, every once in a while I catch myself scanning maps the way I used to, not looking for destinations, but gaps, blank spaces, places with reviews that trail off. I don't go there. I don't test it. That's the other thing I learned. Curiosity is just another way of knocking. Sometimes, late at night, when the building settles and the pipes shift, I hear it. Not the full rhythm, just the beginning. 3. I hold my breath. I don't count backward. I don't wait for confirmation. I let the sound exist without answering it. That's the boundary now. That's the line I draw and defend without explanation. Because some invitations don't expire. They just wait for the right kind of silence. If you camp long enough, if you chase quiet far enough from roads and rules and memory, you'll find places that feel untouched. Places that promise peace the way a still lake promises safety. And most of the time, that promise is real. But if you ever arrive somewhere that feels too prepared for you, too ready, too patient, pay attention. If someone tells you you're the last one for the night, ask yourself what that really means. And if you hear 3 taps in the dark, don't answer. Not with your voice, not with your curiosity, not with your need to know. Some sites stay open because they're still being filled, and some rangers never stop working long after the season ends. The first knock didn't wake me because it was loud. It woke me because it was precise. I was asleep in the back of my Volkswagen camper, wrapped in a blanket that still smelled faintly of gasoline and pine sap, when something struck the door with a firm, measured rhythm. Not a bang, not a scrape. Just 3 deliberate taps, spaced evenly apart, like someone counting under their breath. By the time my eyes opened, my heart was already racing, because even half asleep, I knew exactly what time it was. 2:17 a.m. I didn't check my phone right away. I didn't want to confirm it. I lay there in the dark, listening to the lake breathe outside the van, slow waves lapping against the rocky shore, the wind sliding through the trees like a low whisper. Northern Minnesota in June is quiet in a way that doesn't feel peaceful. The silence has weight to it, like it's waiting for you to make a mistake. My name is Elias. I was 34 that summer, traveling alone, telling myself the solitude was a choice and not something I'd slowly trained myself into after years of not wanting to explain my life to anyone. I grew up in Wisconsin, not far from the border, and I'd always believed I understood the woods, believed they made sense if you respected them. That belief brought me to an isolated lake outside Duluth, a place locals barely mentioned except to say, "Don't stay too long." No campground sign, no fees, just a rough gravel turnout, a fire ring someone had dragged together years ago, and a narrow path down to the water. I told myself it was perfect, quiet, untouched, honest. The first night had been calm, cold, even for June, the kind of cold that creeps up through the soles of your shoes and settles in your bones. I cooked dinner on a small propane stove, watched the sun sink behind the trees, and listened to loons call across the lake. That sound, long and wavering, almost human, had always made me feel grounded. That night, though, it made my skin prickle. I locked the van before bed out of habit more than fear. The Volkswagen was old, cream-colored with thin doors and a lock that felt symbolic more than functional. Still, it was mine, a small, moving world I trusted. At 2:17 a.m., the 3 knocks came again. Tap, tap, tap. I sat up slowly, every muscle tight. The smell hit me first. Damp earth and cold metal, the scent of wet leaves and old rust seeping in through the vents. My breath fogged faintly in the air. I held it, listening. No footsteps, no voice, just the lake and the trees. I waited, counting in my head, trying to convince myself it had been a branch. But branches don't knock in rhythm. They don't stop cleanly after 3. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me back under. I slept in fragments after that, drifting and waking, my body braced for a sound that didn't come again. In the morning, I laughed it off. That's what you do when something doesn't fit neatly into reason. You smooth it over. I stepped outside and inspected the door. No marks, no dents. The ground around the van was soft with pine needles and moss, undisturbed except for my own footprints from the night before. I told myself I'd imagined it. The second night proved me wrong. I spent the day hiking a nearby trail, one the locals used more out of habit than enjoyment. The air smelled like rain, even though the sky stayed clear. Everything felt muted, like the world had turned its volume down a notch. When I came back to the lake, I noticed something I hadn't the day before. A second fire ring. It sat closer to the tree line, stones stacked neatly, unused. No ash, no trash, just there. I didn't remember seeing it before, but I told myself I'd missed it in the dark. Denial is a comfortable place. It lets you stay. That night, the temperature dropped sharply after sunset. I pulled on an extra sweater and sat inside the van with the doors closed, listening to the wind push across the lake. Around midnight, the loons started again, but something about their calls felt off. Too close, too frequent, almost overlapping, like an echo chasing itself. I checked my phone. No signal. The clock glowed softly, 1:58 a.m. I remember thinking, "You're being stupid. You're waiting for something." At exactly 2:17 a.m., the knocks came. Tap, tap, tap. This time I was already sitting up. The sound came from the side door, right behind my head. close enough that I could feel it through the thin metal, a vibration that traveled straight into my jaw. I stayed frozen, every sense sharpened, my mind racing through possibilities. A ranger. A drunk fisherman. Someone lost. Someone would say something, I told myself. Anyone would. No one did. The silence afterward felt intentional, like the knocking had completed its purpose. I stared at the door handle, half expecting it to move. It didn't. Minutes passed, maybe more. Time stretched, thin and brittle. I didn't sleep again that night. In the morning, I found something new. 3 shallow impressions in the dust on the side of the van, just below the handle. Not dents. More like smudges, as if someone had pressed their knuckles there without force. The pattern was unmistakable. 3. I wiped them away with my sleeve, my pulse thudding in my ears. That should have been the moment I left. Packed up. Drove back toward civilization and laughed about it later over bad diner coffee. Instead, I stayed. Because part of me wanted answers, and another part, one I didn't like admitting existed, felt challenged. Like the woods were testing whether I'd listen. That afternoon, a local fisherman stopped by the turnout. Older guy, weathered face. He glanced at my van, then at the lake, his expression tightening just slightly. "You camping here?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "Just a few nights." He nodded slowly. "Hear anything strange?" The question landed heavier than it should have. I hesitated, then shrugged. "Just animals." He studied me for a long moment, then looked away. "Animals don't knock." He didn't elaborate, didn't warn me, just gathered his gear and left, his boots crunching on the gravel until the sound disappeared into the trees. That night, I didn't bother pretending I'd sleep. I sat upright in the driver's seat, keys within reach, eyes fixed on the clock. The air inside the van felt colder than before, like the warmth couldn't hold. Every sound outside made my shoulders tense. The snap of a twig, the splash of something moving in the water. 2:16 a.m. My mouth went dry. The lake went still. No wind, no calls. Even the insects seemed to pause, the quiet pressing in so hard it made my ears ring. At 2:17 a.m., the knock came again, but this time, it wasn't on the door. It came from the back panel. Tap, 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 closer than before, closer than I was ready for. And as I stared into the dark, a new sound followed, so faint I almost missed it. Breathing. Not mine. Not the wind. Right outside the van. The breathing didn't sound rushed. That was what scared me most. It was slow, measured, almost patient. Each inhale shallow, each exhale controlled, as if whoever, or whatever, was standing behind my van understood exactly how thin the metal was between us. I held my breath without realizing it, my chest burning as seconds stretched. My mind tried to catalog the sound the way you do when panic wants structure. Too steady for panic. Too close for comfort. Too intentional to be an animal. The clock on the dashboard glowed 2:17 a.m., unwavering. I reached for the keys with a hand that didn't feel like mine. Metal clicked softly as they brushed together, and the breathing stopped instantly. Not faded, not retreated, just gone, as if sound itself had been switched off. For a moment, I thought that was worse. I didn't start the engine. I couldn't. Something inside me insisted that movement would escalate whatever silent negotiation was happening outside. I sat there, muscles locked, eyes darting between the side mirror and the rear window. Both showed nothing but darkness and the faint outline of trees pressed close, their branches like crooked fingers against the sky. Then came the knock again. This time it wasn't 3, it was 1. Tap. A pause long enough to make my throat tighten. Tap. Another pause. Longer. Tap. The rhythm was wrong now. Curious. Testing. I whispered without meaning to. "Go away." The words felt ridiculous the moment they left my mouth, swallowed by the still air. Outside, something shifted its weight. I heard pine needles compress under a careful step, slow movement circling like it was mapping the van's shape. Denial clawed up inside me. You're exhausted, you're inventing patterns. But denial only works when the world cooperates, and the world outside had gone hostile in a quiet, deliberate way. The handle on the side door moved, just a fraction, enough to make the latch click softly, metal on metal. I surged forward and locked it again, the sound echoing in the van like a gunshot. My pulse roared in my ears, drowning out everything else. I waited for a reaction. Nothing came. Minutes passed, or hours. Time fractured, leaving me stranded between moments. Eventually, dawn bled weakly into the sky, the darkness thinning until the trees took shape again. Birds began to call, tentative at first, then louder, reclaiming the soundscape. I didn't open the door until full daylight. The air outside smelled wrong. Not just damp and green like before, but sour, like stagnant water and something metallic underneath. The ground around the van was marked now. Pine needles disturbed in a loose circle, footprints pressed too deep for how light they looked. Bare feet, too large to be a child, too narrow to be mine. I felt something in me harden then, fear turning into resolve, not because I was brave, but because staying uncertain felt worse than confronting the truth. I packed up fast, shoving gear into cabinets without care, my hands clumsy. As I moved, I noticed scratches along the back panel of the van. 3 sets. Shallow, parallel, not claw marks, fingernails. I drove into Duluth that morning, straight to a gas station crowded with people and noise. The normalcy felt unreal, like I'd crossed between worlds. While the tank filled, I watched my reflection in the window. I looked older than I had 3 days before, hollowed out. Inside, I struck up a conversation with the cashier, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a Minnesotan accent thickened by years of cold air. I didn't tell her everything, just enough. "Is there something out by that lake?" I asked. She paused mid-scan. "Which lake?" I told her. Her mouth tightened. "People hear things out there," she said carefully. "Always at night." "Knocking?" I asked. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Some places don't want company," she said, "and some things don't like to be ignored." I left without asking more. Answers felt dangerous now, like inviting the story to follow me. I parked that night at a rest area closer to town, under bright lights, surrounded by other vehicles. I told myself I was safe, told myself distance would break whatever pattern had formed. At 2:17 a.m., 3 knocks sounded on my window. I jolted upright, heart slamming so hard it hurt. The rest area lights hummed steadily. Cars idled. A trucker laughed somewhere down the row. I checked the clock, hands shaking. 2:17 a.m. The knock came again. Tap, tap, tap. This time it was glass. I stared out the window, my breath shallow, and saw nothing but my own reflection staring back, eyes wide, face pale. The knock repeated, closer to my ear now, as if whatever it was had leaned in. I lost it then. Panic ripped through me, hot and controllable. I slammed the key into the ignition and drove. I didn't stop until the sky lightened again, the road unwinding under my tires like a lifeline. For days after, I slept during daylight and drove at night, trying to outrun a schedule that no longer belonged to me. Every night, I watched the clock, dread pooling as the minutes crawled toward that number. 2:16, 2:17. Sometimes there were knocks, sometimes there weren't. Worse were the nights when there was nothing at all, when the absence felt like anticipation. The realization came slowly, heavy and sickening. It wasn't tied to the lake, it was tied to me. I remembered the second fire ring, the unused one. I remembered how I'd parked my van too close to the trees, how I'd ignored the unease because solitude felt like victory. I thought about the way the fishermen had looked at me, not with fear, but with pity. Somewhere along the way, I'd crossed an invisible line, not geographically, but emotionally. I'd brought something with me, or maybe I'd been carrying it long before Minnesota. The knocks felt less like a threat now and more like a reminder. You heard us. On the 7th night, I stopped fighting it. I parked on a bluff, overlooking a wide, empty stretch of land, nowhere to hide, nothing close enough to press in. I sat in the driver's seat and waited. When the clock turned, my chest tightened, but I didn't flinch. 2:17 a.m. 3 knocks came, soft but unmistakable, from inside the van. Tap, tap, tap. They echoed through the hollow space, not from any surface I could see. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to breathe, to listen past fear. "What do you want?" I whispered. The answer wasn't a voice. It was a feeling, a heavy certainty settling over me like cold fog. Leave. Not just the place. The version of myself that thought solitude meant safety. That believed ignoring instincts was strength. That treated the wilderness like a backdrop instead of a living presence. The knocks never came again after that night. I sold the Volkswagen months later. I still camp, but never alone, never without listening. Every so often, when a sound repeats too precisely or silence settles too suddenly, my stomach tightens. Because I know now, some warnings come gently, and some of them knock. I didn't tell anyone what happened for a long time. Not because I was afraid they wouldn't believe me, but because belief wasn't the point. The story didn't want witnesses. It wanted change. That's what took me the longest to understand. That fear, real fear, doesn't always arrive to hurt you. Sometimes it arrives to strip something away. Sometimes it shows up because you've been refusing to listen to quieter warnings for years. I kept moving after I sold the van. Different rigs, different routes, different people beside me at night. But every campground carried an echo now, like the land remembered me even when I pretended not to remember it. Gravel crunching under tires sounded louder. Wind through canvas felt closer. I paid attention in a way I never had before, and the land noticed. That's not something you're taught growing up. You're taught to conquer, to claim, to park wherever you can and call it freedom. But the woods don't care about your version of freedom. Lakes don't care about your need to disappear. They've been keeping time long before we started naming hours and minutes and pretending those numbers belong to us. The knocks changed how I sleep. Even now, years later, my body still wakes just before 2:17 a.m. Not every night. Just enough that I notice. My eyes open a few seconds early, heart already alert, as if some deeper part of me is still keeping watch. Most nights, there's nothing. Just darkness and breath and the quiet companionship of whoever I'm camping with. But I listen anyway, because what haunted me wasn't the knocking itself. It was how long I'd ignored the instinct to leave long before the first sound ever happened. How I'd confused isolation with peace. How I'd treated silence like emptiness instead of presence. I went back to Minnesota once, years later. Not to that lake. Never there. I stayed farther south in a state park with marked sites and families and the low hum of human life woven into the night. I sat by a fire and watched sparks rise into the dark, carrying little pieces of light upward before vanishing. A man across the loop laughed. A child cried and was comforted. Somewhere, a screen door slammed. It was grounding in a way that surprised me. That night, as I lay in my tent, the air cooled and the woods settled. I listened, not for danger, but for balance, for the difference between warning and welcome. The night spoke the way it always does, through subtle shifts, a breeze that doesn't return, a bird that stops mid-call, a stillness that presses instead of rests. None of it turned sharp. At 2:17 a.m., I was awake. Nothing knocked. I exhaled, slow and deep, and for the first time since that summer near Duluth, my body unclenched, not because I felt victorious, but because I felt aligned, like I'd finally learned the rules I'd been pretending didn't apply to me. Here's what I carry with me now, and what I offer to anyone who takes their home on wheels into the wild places of this country. Pay attention to repetition. The land repeats itself when it's trying to be understood. Sounds that return at the same time, feelings that resurface without reason, unease that doesn't fade with daylight. Those aren't coincidences. They're conversations you didn't realize you were part of. Respect the no. Not every place wants you. Not every quiet is an invitation. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is stay somewhere just to prove you can. Pride has a way of blinding you to exits that were always open. And if something knocks, really knocks, don't wait for it to knock harder. Because whatever stood outside my van that summer didn't need to force its way in. It just needed me to understand that I was being measured the same way I'd measured the woods. The same way we all do until something measures us back. I still camp. I still chase roads that disappear into trees and lakes that mirror the sky, but I don't pretend I'm alone out there anymore. I introduce myself quietly. I listen before I settle. I leave when something in my chest tightens without explanation, and every now and then, when the night goes perfectly still and the silence presses close enough to feel personal, I remember those 3 knocks: steady, patient, exact. Not a threat, a warning I was lucky enough to survive. Because some people never listen, and the woods keep knocking until you do. The first sign something was wrong wasn't fear. It was silence, the kind that presses inward like a held breath you don't realize you're sharing with the dark. My name's Aaron. I was 34 that summer, running west with no real destination, just the thin, stubborn belief that motion could sand down the rough edges of the year I just survived. August 2021 had a way of making people restless. Smoke hung over half the country, tempers were short, and everywhere I stopped, folks talked about leaving, jobs, marriages, whole lives folded up and stuffed into storage. I drove a faded Volkswagen camper van I'd rebuilt myself, a boxy old thing with sun-cracked paint and a stubborn engine that sounded like it cleared its throat before every hill. It wasn't fast, but it was loyal. Or at least I thought it was. Eastern Oregon wasn't part of the plan. I'd aimed for Idaho originally, then the coast, then maybe nothing at all. I let the GPS decide most days, a small act of surrender that felt easier than choosing wrong on my own. That night, the screen flickered as I crossed into a stretch of high desert where the land flattens out and the sky grows heavy with stars. The air smelled dry and faintly metallic, like heated stone. My phone chirped once, recalculating, then suggested a detour, 70 miles off the highway to avoid an accident I'd never see. I hesitated. The rational part of me counted fuel, daylight, cell service. The tired part of me wanted a place to park, a rectangle of ground where no one would knock on my window and ask what I was doing there. The detour promised an RV park, Juniper Wells Campground, it said, with a green tree icon and a cluster of 5-star reviews that loaded too slowly to read. I remember thinking that I'd never heard of it. I'd been crisscrossing this state for years. I told myself that was the point of travel, to find what you didn't know existed. The road narrowed almost immediately. Asphalt gave way to patched gravel, then to a washboard dirt track that rattled the cabinets and set my teeth on edge. The sky deepened to indigo. Sagebrush leaned in like it wanted to hear what I was thinking. With every mile, the radio faded to static, then to nothing. The GPS arrow kept moving, calm and confident, like it had done this 1,000 times before. I passed no houses, no fences, no signs except one, rusted and half-buried, that read "No services next 50 miles." I laughed out loud at that. Laughed because it felt better than acknowledging the prickle crawling up my neck. I told myself I was being dramatic. I told myself I'd driven worse roads for less reward. When the campground appeared, it did so all at once, a sudden pocket of light in a bowl of darkness. Strings of warm bulbs hung between juniper trees. A wooden arch spanned the entrance road, hand-painted letters spelling "Welcome Home." The phrase snagged my attention, not because it was ominous, but because it felt too intimate, like someone using my name before I'd given it. Inside, the place was fully alive. A dozen rigs were parked in neat rows. Fifth wheels, motorhomes, a few vans like mine. I saw people moving between them, silhouettes crossing pools of light. Someone laughed. Somewhere, a radio played a country song I hadn't heard in years. The smell of grilling meat drifted through my open window, rich and comforting. Relief loosened something in my chest I hadn't realized I was holding. I rolled up to a small office built from rough timber, a porch sagging slightly under the weight of potted plants. A man stepped out as I cut the engine. He was in his late 50s, maybe older, with a beard gone white at the edges and eyes that reflected the porch light too brightly. He didn't introduce himself, just smiled, wide and practiced. "Long drive," he said, not as a question. "Yeah," I answered. "Didn't expect to find this place." "Most folks don't," he said, and the way he said it made the words feel heavier than they should have. "Name? Aaron." He nodded like he'd expected that too and flipped open a ledger. The paper inside was thick, yellowed, the names written in careful script that felt out of time. No computer. No card reader. When I asked about payment, he waved a hand. "Settle up in the morning," he said. "You'll want a good night's rest." He assigned me a spot at the far edge of the grounds, backed up against a line of trees that swallowed the light. As I drove there, I noticed things that didn't fit together cleanly. The rigs looked lived in, but not recent. License plates from states that no longer issued that design. A satellite dish rusted into immobility. A woman watering plants at a picnic table looked up as I passed, her expression flat, her gaze lingering a beat too long. I parked, leveled the van, and stepped outside. The night air was colder than it had any right to be in August, a chill that slipped under my shirt and stayed there. Crickets cheered in uneven bursts, like a code I didn't know how to break. Somewhere beyond the trees, something knocked, wood on wood, slow and deliberate. I told myself it was someone setting up late, hammering stakes. I told myself a lot of things. I made a simple dinner, kept the lights low. Through my window, I could see other campers doing the same. Curtains drawn, lanterns glowing. A sense of being watched crept in anyway, subtle at first, like the awareness of a weight shifting behind you. I tried to shake it off. I'd spent too much time alone that year, let my thoughts turn feral. That was all this was. The first knock came an hour later. It wasn't loud, just a gentle tap on the side of the van near the sliding door. I froze, fork halfway to my mouth. Another tap followed, same spot, same pressure. My heart picked up, not racing yet, just attentive. "Yeah?" I called, my voice sounding thin in the small space. No answer. I waited, counting breaths. When nothing else happened, I told myself it was a branch, the cooling metal contracting. I finished eating, I washed my dishes. I locked the doors anyway. Sleep didn't come easily. The mattress felt wrong, too firm, like it was pushing back. The air inside the van grew stale, carrying a smell I couldn't place, dust and something faintly sweet, almost rotten. I cracked a window. The cold rushed in, sharp and immediate. From outside, the knocking returned. Farther away now, rhythmic. 3 taps. A pause. 3 taps. It sounded less like hammering and more like someone practicing patience. I lay there, eyes open, tracing the pattern in my head until it broke apart. At some point, exhaustion dragged me under. I woke before dawn, the sky just beginning to pale. For a moment, I didn't know where I was. Then the memory of the campground settled in, heavy and unwelcome. I sat up, heart thudding, and listened. Silence. No generators, no early risers clanking coffee mugs, no birds. I pushed open the door and stepped out, the cold biting harder now, numbing my fingers. The air smelled clean, stripped of last night's warmth. I turned in a slow circle. The campground was empty. Every rig was gone. The strings of lights hung dark and lifeless, cords cut clean in places, bulbs shattered on the ground. The office porch sagged lower, the plants wilted and brown. Tire tracks led nowhere, stopping abruptly at the edge of the dirt road as if erased. My phone buzzed in my hand, GPS spinning, unable to find anything to anchor itself to. Where Juniper Wells had been, there was only a clearing and a line of trees pressing closer than they had any right to. I stood there, breath fogging, the realization blooming late and sickening. I had followed a road that didn't exist to a place that had no intention of being found again. Didn't panic right away. Panic, I've learned, needs something solid to push against. And standing there in that emptied clearing, my mind kept sliding off the truth like rain on glass. I told myself I'd woken up early and missed the rush, that everyone had caravanned out before sunrise to beat the heat or smoke or some unspoken rule locals didn't bother explaining. I told myself the lights were taken down, not cut, that the broken bulbs meant nothing more than clumsiness in the dark. But my body didn't believe any of it. The cold had settled deeper now, crawling up from the ground through the soles of my boots. The silence felt engineered, as if sound itself had been asked to leave. I walked toward where the office had been, my footsteps too loud, each crunch of gravel sounding like a violation. The ledger was gone. The door hung open on one hinge, wood splintered not by force but by age, like it had been waiting years for someone to notice it was ready to fall apart. I called out. My voice disappeared the moment it left my mouth, swallowed by the trees. Behind the office, where I remembered a row of picnic tables and a communal fire pit, there was nothing but flattened dirt and a circle of stones half sunk into the earth. Ash sat inside the ring, gray and powder fine, cold to the touch. I rubbed it between my fingers, feeling the grit cling to my skin. It smelled old. Not last night's fire, older than that, like something burned long ago and kept smoldering in memory alone. The knocking returned then, not close, not far. 3 taps echoing faintly from different directions at once, as if the sound couldn't decide where it belonged. My chest tightened. I spun, scanning the tree line. Juniper branches twisted together, dense and shadowed, their needles whispering against each other in a breeze I couldn't feel. "Hello?" I said again, louder this time, the word cracking on the end. Nothing answered. The tapping stopped. I hurried back to the van, movements sharp and clumsy. Inside, the space felt smaller than it had the night before, the walls pressing in, holding the chill. I tried the ignition. The engine coughed, then settled into a rough idle that vibrated through the steering wheel. Relief flared, brief and bright. Machines were honest. They either worked or they didn't. I pulled out my phone, hands shaking enough to make the screen blur. No signal, no map, just a blank grid and the pulsing blue dot of my own location, stubborn and unhelpful. When I zoomed out, the detour road didn't exist. The GPS insisted I was standing in an unmarked stretch of public land miles from anywhere. The campground erased as cleanly as chalk from a board. I drove anyway. The road back was narrower than I remembered, the dirt softer, tires sinking slightly with every rotation. The trees leaned closer, their branches scraping the sides of the van with a sound like fingernails on tin. The knocking threaded itself into that noise, irregular now, sometimes keeping time with my heartbeat, sometimes skipping ahead, impatient. After 10 minutes that felt like an hour, the road split without warning. No sign, no indication of which way led out. I slowed, indecision blooming into dread. The GPS arrow spun uselessly. I chose left at random, my stomach dropping as if I'd stepped off a ledge. The landscape began to repeat itself. A distinctive boulder shaped like a crouched animal passed my window. Then it passed again, and again. The smell inside the van changed, turning damp, carrying an undercurrent of decay that hadn't been there before. I rolled down the window despite the cold. The air outside was worse, thick, heavy, pressing against my lungs. That was when I saw the first person. He stood in the road ahead, back turned, wearing a jacket too thin for the temperature. I slowed, heart slamming into my ribs. Relief tangled with fear, proof that I wasn't alone, that this place hadn't emptied itself entirely. "Hey," I called through the open window. "You okay?" He didn't turn, didn't react at all. I inched closer, foot hovering over the brake. The knocking grew louder, sharper, now clearly coming from him, or from the space around him. 3 taps. Pause. 3 taps. "Aren't you cold?" I tried, my voice sounding wrong, stretched thin. When he turned, I wished he hadn't. His face was slack, eyes unfocused, mouth parted as if he'd been interrupted mid-thought. He looked through me, not at me, gaze fixed somewhere just past my shoulder. His skin had a gray cast, like ash rubbed too thin. He raised one hand slowly and knocked on the side of the van, matching the rhythm I'd been hearing since the night before. Tap, tap, tap. I slammed the accelerator. The van lurched forward, gravel spraying. In the mirror, he didn't move, just stood there, arm dropping back to his side, watching as if my escape confirmed something he'd already known. The road straightened, then dissolved into nothing. Trees closed in, branches tangling overhead until the sky disappeared entirely. Panic finally found its footing. My breath came fast and shallow, vision tunneling. I thought of all the times I'd ignored my instincts on the road, pulled over when something felt off, left when it didn't. How many nights I'd stayed because leaving felt rude or paranoid or lonely. The knocking erupted from all sides at once, a cacophony of taps and thuds, metal answering wood, wood answering back. The van shuddered as if struck by a sudden wind. I screamed then, a raw sound, torn loose from somewhere deep and unguarded. And just as suddenly, it stopped. The road reappeared beneath my tires, solid and familiar. Trees fell back. The sky opened up, pale and washed with morning light. Ahead, a paved highway cut across the dirt track like a promise. I burst onto it without slowing, tires squealing, heart still racing long after I'd put miles between me and that clearing. I didn't stop until the sun was fully up, until I found a gas station with peeling paint and a hand-lettered sign that said, "Open." The smell of coffee and oil grounded me, reality seeping back in around the edges. The attendant looked up as I came in, eyes flicking to my face with a frown. "You look like you saw a ghost," he said. I almost laughed, almost cried. Instead, I asked about Juniper Wells Campground, tried to keep my voice steady. He shook his head slowly. "No such place," he said. "Not now. Not ever." When I showed him the GPS route, the blank space where it should have been, his expression tightened. "People get turned around out there," he added, after a moment. "Best stick to marked roads." I nodded, paid for gas I didn't need, and left. I drove until the land changed, until the trees thinned and the air warmed, until the knocking faded into memory. But some nights, when the van settles and the world goes quiet, I hear it again. 3 taps, patient and persistent, and I know that some places don't disappear. They wait. I didn't tell anyone the full story for a long time. Not friends, not family, not the other travelers I met who swapped campground recommendations like trading cards. I learned quickly that some experiences don't survive being spoken out loud. They shrink, warp, turn into anecdotes when they were never meant to be small. So I kept it folded inside me, quiet and heavy, like a map you don't unfold because you're afraid it might still lead somewhere. But the road has a way of testing what you think you've buried. For weeks after Eastern Oregon, I stayed close to highways and populated campgrounds. I chose places with office numbers posted clearly, with Google reviews that mentioned birthdays and bad Wi-Fi and friendly hosts named Carol or Mike. I parked under floodlights. I slept with the radio on low, voices bleeding together into a human hum that kept the silence at bay. I told myself I was being cautious, not afraid. Still, my senses felt permanently recalibrated. Every sound carried extra weight. The pop of cooling metal at night made my shoulders tense. A knock, any knock, sent a jolt through me before reason could catch up. I started waking before dawn without an alarm, heart already racing, bracing myself for the moment I'd step outside and find everything gone again. The strangest part wasn't the fear. It was the pull. Somewhere deep under the panic and the logic and the anger at myself for following a screen into nowhere, there was a thread of longing I didn't want to examine too closely. Juniper Wells, if that's what it was, had felt wrong, yes, but it had also felt intentional. Like I'd been expected. Like the road hadn't just led me there, but chosen me when I was already worn thin, already drifting, already quiet enough to listen. That realization scared me more than the knocking ever did. I started researching anyway, unable to help myself. Old maps, archived campground listings, county records. I spent nights parked under cell towers, scrolling through forums and defunct websites until my eyes burned. I found references to a settlement in that region that never quite took hold, an experimental campground in the late 70s meant to attract long-term RV residents, retirees looking to drop out of the grid before dropping out of life. It promised self-sufficiency, community, a place off the map in more ways than one. The project failed. Funding dried up, permits lapsed. Officially, it was abandoned before it ever opened. Unofficially, there were comments buried deep in threads from people who'd driven the back roads and sworn they'd seen lights, heard voices, been waved in by someone who looked relieved to see them. Most posts ended the same way. Confusion, missing time, a morning where nothing matched the night before. A few mentioned knocking. I closed my laptop every time my chest tightened too much, every time the pull grew stronger. Knowing didn't make it better. It just gave the fear a shape. By October, the weather turned. Nights sharpened. The van's heater struggled. I found myself in northern Nevada, parked outside a nearly empty rest area as snow threatened in the distance. The place was quiet, but not wrong. Trucks idled in the distance. The smell of diesel anchored me in the present. I slept better than I had in months. Sometime after midnight, I woke to a familiar sound. Tap, tap, tap. It came from the outside of the van, gentle and precise, exactly where it had been before. My body reacted before my mind did, heart slamming, breath locked halfway in. For a moment, I couldn't move. The dark pressed close, thick with expectation. Another set of taps answered from farther away, then another, not surrounding me, not attacking, just waiting. I sat up slowly, every nerve screaming not to. My hand hovered over the door handle, shaking. The part of me that wanted answers, the part that had followed the detour in the first place, leaned forward. The smarter part screamed to stay still, to let morning come, to let the sound pass like a bad dream. That was the conflict I hadn't faced back in Oregon. Not fear of dying, but fear of staying lost. Fear that if I didn't choose, the road would keep choosing for me. The tapping stopped. Silence rushed in to fill the space it left, heavier than sound. Minutes passed. Nothing happened. Eventually, my breathing slowed. I lay back down, eyes open until dawn bled gray into the sky. When morning came, the rest area was exactly as it should be. No marks on the van, no footprints in the frost. Trucks pulled in and out, drivers nodding at me like I was just another traveler passing through. I understood then that whatever Juniper Wells was, it didn't need to follow me everywhere. It only needed me to hesitate, to doubt my instincts long enough to invite it back in. So I changed how I traveled. I stopped outsourcing my decisions to a screen. I studied paper maps again, learned the feel of a road by how it curved and climbed. I listened when something felt off, even if I couldn't explain why. Especially then, I left places early. I trusted the unease instead of negotiating with it. And slowly, the knocking faded. Not disappeared. Faded. Like a sound you only hear if you strain for it. I still camp. I still love the way the land opens up when you give it space, the way night settles differently depending on where you are. But I've learned that not every welcome sign is meant for you, and not every road wants to let you go once you've taken it. Some campgrounds aren't destinations. They're tests. Tests of how well you know yourself when no one's watching, of whether you can tell the difference between solitude and erasure, of whether you'll keep driving when the map goes blank or pull over, step out into the dark, and knock back. Because out there in the unmarked places, there are still lights that come on when they shouldn't, doors that open without a sound, hands that tap patiently, certain that sooner or later someone will answer, and the only thing standing between you and becoming part of the landscape is the choice to keep moving when everything tells you to stay. The first voice didn't sound threatening. It sounded familiar, like someone who already knew us. My name is Elliot Harper. I was 36 that fall, old enough to believe I could tell the difference between danger and imagination, old enough to trust my instincts while still explaining them away when they became inconvenient. In October of 2019, my wife, Lena, our 4-year-old son, Caleb, and our 8-month-old daughter, Mara, took our Volkswagen camper, an old, cream-colored VW Westphalia with more miles than excuses, up into the mountains just outside Asheville, North Carolina. We weren't chasing adventure. We were running from noise. The city had started to feel like a low-grade fever that never broke. Sirens at night, neighbors arguing through drywall, the constant hum of other people's lives bleeding into our own. Lena had grown up camping in western North Carolina. She said the woods there didn't just quiet you, they reorganized you. I wanted that. I needed it. I wanted my kids to remember stars instead of screens. The campground sat just off a winding road that climbed into hardwood forest, already halfway surrendered to autumn. The air smelled like wet leaves and wood smoke, that sharp, clean rot that only shows up when summer finally lets go. Our site backed up to a steep slope of trees, their trunks blackened by rain, their leaves whispering even when there was no wind. From the beginning, the place felt watchful, not hostile, just attentive, like we'd interrupted something mid-thought. I noticed it when I stepped out of the van to level the wheels. The forest didn't echo. Sounds didn't travel the way they should have. My boots crunched leaves, but the noise died a few feet from me. A crow called somewhere uphill, then went silent as if it had realized it was being impolite. I told myself that's just how mountains work. We set up quickly. October evenings dropped fast in the Blue Ridge, and by the time we finished, the light had thinned into something metallic and cold. Lena put Mara down in the back of the van, tucking her into the small crib we'd bolted in place. Caleb curled up with his dinosaur blanket on the bench seat, already half asleep. The baby monitor came out almost as an afterthought. We'd bought it the week before, cheap, simple, audio only. No Wi-Fi, no video feed. Just a transmitter clipped near Mara's crib and a handheld receiver we could carry outside while cooking or sitting by the fire. I liked that it was dumb. I liked that nothing could get into it. That night, the woods pressed in closer than I expected. Firelight bent the trees into tall, moving silhouettes. Smoke clung low, refusing to rise, carrying the smell of sap and damp bark. Somewhere to our left, another camper laughed once, then nothing. No music. No generators, just the fire, the leaves, and the slow creak of the forest adjusting its weight. Lena leaned into me, her shoulder warm through my jacket. "This is good," she said quietly. "This is exactly what I remembered." I wanted to believe her. The baby monitor sat on the picnic table between us, its green light steady, its speaker hissing softly with the sound of Mara's breathing. Every now and then, a tiny grunt or sigh came through, intimate and grounding. Proof that the world was still normal, that we were just a family in the woods, nothing more. Then, underneath the static, I heard a whisper. At first, I thought it was interference, the kind you get when a radio catches a fragment of something else and immediately lets it go. A breath of sound shaped vaguely like a word. I leaned closer. Lena noticed the shift in my posture. "What?" "Nothing," I said. "Just thought I heard." The monitor crackled again. This time, the voice was clearer. "White curtains." I froze. Lena sat up. "Did you say something?" "No." My throat felt tight, dry. "Did you?" The monitor hissed. A pause. Then the white curtains are pulled halfway. The crib's on the left. Lena's hand went to her mouth. The fire popped loudly, sending a spray of sparks upward. I snatched the monitor off the table, holding it like it might burn me. My heart thudded so hard I could feel it in my ears. "That's," Lena whispered. "That's inside the van." I stood up too fast, the world tilting. It's interference, I said immediately. The words came out rehearsed, automatic. Someone else has a monitor on the same frequency. They're describing their own setup. But even as I said it, I knew how thin it sounded. Our van wasn't standard. The curtains were handmade. Lena's mother had sewn them years ago. The crib placement wasn't typical either. And the voice wasn't distant or distorted the way interference usually is. It was close, intimate, calm, like someone standing in the same room. I clicked the monitor off. The silence that followed was worse. No hiss, no breathing, just the fire and the forest and the sudden unbearable awareness of how far away the van felt from where we stood. Elliot. Lena said, her voice low and tight. Go check. I will, I said. I didn't move. Every instinct in me screamed, don't leave the light. Don't step away from the only thing holding the dark at bay. I told myself that was cowardice, that I was projecting fear onto coincidence, that being a father meant walking toward the van, not away from it. I grabbed the flashlight. The beam cut a narrow tunnel through the trees, illuminating trunks and fallen branches. Nothing else. The path to the van felt longer than it had an hour earlier, the ground uneven, the leaves slick. With every step, the forest seemed to lean closer, listening. The van sat exactly where we'd left it. Doors closed, windows dark, no movement. I unlocked it, flung the door open, and flicked on the interior light. Mara slept peacefully, her chest rising and falling. The curtains hung just as described, half pulled, crooked at the bottom where the clip didn't quite hold. I checked the locks, all secure. I checked under the van, around it, inside the tiny bathroom. Nothing. No one. I told myself to breathe. When I came back to the fire, Lena was standing, arms wrapped around herself, eyes fixed on the darkness behind me. She's fine, I said quickly. Everything's fine. She nodded, but she didn't relax. We turned the monitor back on. Static. Breathing. Minutes passed. The fire burned down. The woods settled into a deeper quiet, thus the kind that feels deliberate. I started to believe my own explanation. I started to feel embarrassed by how hard my hands were shaking. Then the whisper came back. The father checked the locks. Lena screamed. I slapped the monitor to the ground, crushing the speaker under my boot. The sound cut off mid-breath. For a moment, there was nothing but our own panic, raw and loud and human. Then, from the darkness beyond the firelight, something shifted. Slow, careful. And I realized with sick clarity that whatever had been speaking to us hadn't been guessing. It had been watching. The woods didn't rush us. They waited. That was the worst part. How patient everything suddenly felt. No footsteps, no snapping branches, no panicked retreat from whatever had shifted beyond the firelight. Just the slow, deliberate quiet of something that knew it didn't need to hurry. Lena grabbed my arm hard enough to hurt. Get the kids, she said. Not panicked, focused. Her voice had that tone she only used in real emergencies, the one that cut through denial like a blade. I didn't argue. I ran. The path back to the van felt wrong under my feet, like the ground had subtly rearranged itself while my back was turned. My flashlight beam shook, skidding across trees, catching nothing long enough to reassure me. Every shadow looked intentional now. Every dark space felt occupied. Inside the van, the air was warmer than it should have been. Stale. Like someone else's breath had been trapped there and hadn't quite dissipated. Mara, I whispered, even though I knew she was fine. She slept on, oblivious. I scooped her up, her small weight grounding and terrifying all at once. I half expected her to cry, to react to the fear pouring off me, but she didn't. That somehow made it worse. Caleb stirred when I touched his shoulder. Daddy, he murmured. We're going for a drive, buddy, I said. Middle of the night adventure. He smiled faintly, already drifting back toward sleep. I carried him too, awkwardly balancing both kids, my shoulder screaming, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might wake them both. When I stepped back into the clearing, Lena was standing at the edge of the firelight, holding the crowbar we kept under the seat. She looked smaller than I'd ever seen her, framed by darkness, her eyes too bright. Did you hear anything? She asked. No, I said. Did you? She shook her head. But I felt it, like pressure, like someone leaning in close. We didn't pack. We didn't put the fire out properly. We just moved. I strapped Caleb into his seat with shaking hands, set Mara down long enough to buckle her in, climb the wheel. The engine hesitated. I turned the key again. Nothing but a click. Elliot, Lena said too calmly. Try again. I did. The engine coughed, then stalled. A familiar problem. We dealt with it before in cold weather. Normally, I'd tap the gas, wait a second, coax it. Normally, I wasn't convinced we were being hunted. The forest leaned closer. Not physically, psychologically. The dark pressed in at the edges of my vision, narrowing my focus until all I could see was the dashboard, the fogged windshield, Lena's reflection staring back at me. I turned the key a third time. The engine roared to life. Lena exhaled a sob she hadn't realized she was holding. I threw the van into gear and rolled forward, gravel crunching loud in the silence. That's when the baby monitor, cracked, crushed off, spoke from the floor. "Seatbelts first," the voice whispered. I slammed the brakes so hard Caleb cried out. "No," Lena said. No. The monitor lay in two pieces near the pedals, its green light dead, and yet the voice came through anyway, clearer than before. Calm, observational. The boy's scared. He doesn't like sudden stops. I kicked the monitor toward the door. I then flung it out into the darkness without slowing. It vanished into the leaves with a dull thud. "Drive," Lena said. "Do not stop." I didn't. The road out of the campground was narrow and unlit, a ribbon of gravel twisting downhill through dense trees. My headlights felt weak, barely pushing back the dark. Every curve threatened to reveal something standing in the road, something waiting for us to slow down. The voice didn't come back. That should have been a relief. Instead, it felt like a held breath. Halfway down the mountain, the fog rolled in, thick, sudden, swallowing the road in seconds. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. I slowed despite myself, my knuckles white on the wheel. "This can't be happening," I muttered. This is just a bad coincidence stacked on top of another." Lena didn't answer. I glanced at her. She was staring straight ahead, her face pale, her jaw tight. "What?" I asked. "I grew up here," she said quietly. "My parents camped in these mountains every summer. You know how many stories like this I heard?" I swallowed. "How many?" "Enough that they all blurred together," she said. "Enough that I stopped believing them." The fog thickened. The van's interior felt smaller by the second. Too warm, too close. I cracked the window, desperate for fresh air. That's when the smell hit me. Not rot, not smoke. Something human. Sweat, old fabric, the faint metallic tang of breath that hasn't been outside in a while. It seeped in through the vents, through the cracks, unmistakable and wrong. Lena smelled it too. I saw it in her eyes. "They're close," she whispered. The road curved sharply left. I followed it, tires skidding slightly on damp gravel. For a split second, my headlights caught something standing just off the road. Tall, motionless, too thin to be a tree. Then it was gone. I didn't say anything, neither did Lena. Some things feel more dangerous once they're spoken. The fog began to thin as we descended, the forest loosening its grip inch. My chest ached from how long I'd been holding my breath. When we finally hit pavement, I almost cried. We drove straight to the nearest gas station, lights blazing, people everywhere. I parked crooked across two spaces and just sat there, shaking, the adrenaline crashing all at once. Lena got out first, pacing, trying to calm herself before she checked on the kids. They were fine. Caleb had fallen back asleep. Mara hadn't made a sound. Inside the station, under fluorescent lights that felt like a blessing, I called the campground office. A tired voice answered. "There was someone broadcasting on our baby monitor," I said. "They knew details. They were describing our van." A pause. "That's not the first time we've heard something like that," the man said carefully. My stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" "People mess with frequencies," he said. "Hunters, locals, sometimes they pick up things they shouldn't. Sometimes they do it on purpose." "On purpose how?" Another pause. Longer this time. "Sir," he said, "you did the right thing by leaving. We didn't go back that night, or the next morning, or ever." Weeks passed, then months. I replaced the monitor. I checked frequencies obsessively. I read forums, convinced myself there were explanations, technical ones, human ones. I told myself fear had filled in gaps reality hadn't. But sometimes late at night, when the house is quiet and the kids are asleep, I'll catch myself listening to the silence between sounds, waiting. Because the thing about that voice wasn't just what it knew, it was how calmly it watched us panic, like it had all the time in the world. Thought leaving the mountains would end it. That distance alone would cauterize whatever had reached into our lives that night, but fear doesn't respect geography, and memory doesn't care about state lines. We drove home in silence, the sky paling behind us, the fog thinning into something almost beautiful. By the time we crossed into daylight, the world had resumed its normal shape. Coffee shops opened, cars honked, people stood in line for pastries, unaware that just hours earlier, my understanding of safety had quietly collapsed. For a while, I convinced myself that was enough. The kids adjusted quickly. Caleb forgot almost everything by the time we pulled into our driveway. Mara never knew there was anything to forget. Lena and I told ourselves that was the natural order. Children absorb shock and release it, while adults store it like shrapnel. But something had followed us home, not physically. Not in any way I could point to and name. It was subtler than that. The first night back, I woke to silence so complete it felt artificial. No traffic, no wind, no refrigerator hum. I lay there staring at the ceiling, counting breaths that didn't feel like mine. Then I heard it, a whisper so faint it barely qualified as sound. He's awake. I sat up so fast my vision blurred. The baby monitor on the nightstand was dark, unplugged. I'd packed it away the moment we got home, shoved it into a box in the garage like an object that could contaminate the house by proximity alone. The whisper didn't come from it. It came from the space between the sounds in the room, from the silence itself. I stood there shaking, listening, waiting for it to repeat. It didn't. The house slowly refilled with ordinary noise, the distant rush of a car, the click of the HVAC turning on. I told myself I'd dreamed it. Stress does that. Trauma borrows voices. I didn't tell Lena. Instead, I started changing things. I installed new locks, motion lights, cameras that covered every angle of the yard. I checked windows before bed, then twice. Then again at 3 a.m, heart racing, convinced I'd missed something. Lena noticed, of course. She always did. "You can't keep doing this," she said one evening, her voice tired but gentle. "We're safe here." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to hand the fear back to the mountains and pretend it belonged there. But a part of me, quiet, stubborn, awake at night, knew better. Because what haunted me wasn't the idea of someone breaking in. It was the memory of being observed without resistance. Weeks later, I finally went back online. Not the campground website, not the official channels. I went where people go when they don't want reassurance. They want patterns, forums, comment sections, archived threads that hadn't been updated in years. It didn't take long. Stories surfaced like bruises under skin, different locations, different families, same details, audio-only monitors, voices describing interiors, calm narration of private spaces, sometimes just whispers, sometimes laughter, and always, always the same advice buried deep in the replies. Leave immediately. Don't engage. Don't respond. One post stopped me cold. A man from Tennessee. Similar setup, similar timing. He wrote about hearing his own movements described back to him through a baby monitor. How the voice had known when he hesitated, when he turned around, when he reached for his child. His last line sat there like a held breath. It didn't feel like they wanted to hurt us. It felt like they wanted us to know how easy it would be. I closed the laptop and sat in the dark long after the screen went black. That's when I understood the real lesson of that night. Not the one about preparedness or technology or trusting your instincts. It was about vulnerability. RV camping had always felt like freedom to me. Open roads, open spaces, thin walls between you and the world. I'd romanticized that exposure, framed it as bravery, as simplicity. But standing in those mountains, hearing a stranger describe my sleeping children, I realized how thin the line really was between openness and invitation. The woods hadn't been the danger, neither had the campground. It was the assumption that isolation meant privacy. I still camp, we still travel. I refuse to let fear claim that part of our lives. But I camp differently now, deliberately, with boundaries that don't rely on hope. No audio monitors, no open frequencies, no ignoring the weight of silence when it settles too neatly around you. And I listen to my wife, to my gut, to the quiet alarm that goes off when something feels too aware of me. Sometimes, late at night, I'll wake up and check the kids' rooms. I stand in the doorway watching their chests rise and fall, letting the rhythm steady me. The house is quiet, normal quiet. But every now and then, just before sleep takes me again, I remember that voice. Not what it said, but how it said it. Patient, observant, almost gentle. As if it had been reminding me of something I'd forgotten. That the world is full of listeners, and not all of them need to knock to be let in. I didn't realize how loud silence could be until it followed me across West Texas. My name is Caleb Morgan. I was 38 that winter, a few years removed from a divorce that left me with more square footage in a Volkswagen camper than in my heart, and a habit of driving at night because darkness felt honest. February 2023 had settled into Texas like a held breath, cold without snow, empty without peace. And I told myself I was camping for clarity, for distance, for the simple American ritual of pointing your vehicle west and trusting the road to sand you down into something simpler. I had the van packed light, water, coffee, a single burner stove, a sleeping bag that smelled faintly of motor oil and cedar from some previous life, no weapons, no dog, just me, the hum of the engine, and the lie that solitude is the same thing as safety. The first rest stop was outside Sweetwater, just past midnight. Not a campground, not even a real destination, just a concrete island off I-20 with flickering sodium lights and a wind that smelled like dust and old rain. I pulled in because my eyes were burning and my thoughts were starting to loop, the way they do when you've been alone too long with the same memories. I told myself it was practical. I told myself I'd sleep for an hour and move on. The lot was empty, except for one semi idling near the far edge. Its engine ticked like a cooling animal. The bathroom building sat low and windowless, a bunker with a buzzing light over the door. I parked nose out, like I always do, habit drilled into me by years of traveling alone. I killed the engine, and the silence rushed in so fast it made my ears ring. That's when I saw him. He was standing near the vending machines, half in shadow, half in that sickly yellow light. A man. Tall, thin, dressed wrong for the cold, no jacket, just a dark button-down shirt tucked neatly into slacks, hands at his sides, no phone, no bag. He wasn't pacing or leaning or smoking. He was just there, watching. I remember thinking, you're tired, you're projecting. Rest stops collect the strange and the stranded. I'd seen worse. But as my eyes adjusted, something snagged my attention and wouldn't let go. He wasn't blinking, not once. I counted without meaning to. 5 seconds. 10. 15. His eyes stayed open, glassy and fixed, reflecting the vending machine lights like coins at the bottom of a well. People blink, even when they stare, even when they're trying not to. It's involuntary, but this man's face didn't move at all. No twitch, no swallow, no shift of weight. The wind pushed an empty plastic bottle across the lot, scraping and rattling. The semi shut down with a hiss, plunging the far end into deeper dark. The man didn't react. His gaze stayed locked on my windshield, on me. I didn't wave. I didn't nod. I didn't get out. Denial came first. It always does. Maybe he's blind. Maybe he's on something. Maybe he's just weird. West Texas is full of weird, and I've learned not to confuse discomfort with danger. Still, I locked the doors. I leaned back and closed my eyes, telling myself I'd rest without sleeping. Just breathe. Just let the road drain out of me. The ticking of the engine metal cooled into stillness. My breath fogged the windshield, then cleared. Minutes passed. When I opened my eyes again, he was closer. Not rushing, not sneaking. Just closer in the way a shadow gets closer when the sun drops. He stood now at the edge of my headlights, close enough that I could see the lines in his face. He looked older than I first thought. Late 40s, maybe. Pale skin pulled tight over sharp cheekbones. Lips pressed together like he was holding back a comment he'd rehearsed too many times. Still not blinking. My pulse started to thud in my ears, heavy and insistent. The quiet unease sharpened into tension, then suspicion. I ran through explanations like a checklist. He wants money. He needs help. He's waiting for the bathroom. None of them fit the way he was standing, square to the van, shoulders relaxed, eyes fixed. I cracked the window an inch, just enough to let my voice out and the cold in. "Hey," I said. My voice sounded thin, unfamiliar. "You all right?" He didn't answer. Didn't move. Didn't blink. The wind carried the smell of ozone and dust. Somewhere far off, a train horn moaned, long and lonely. I waited for him to react to that, to anything. He didn't. I rolled the window back up. Panic doesn't arrive all at once. It seeps. It fills the gaps between rational thoughts until there's no room left to stand. I started the engine, hands shaking more than I wanted to admit, and the headlights flared brighter. For a split second, the light washed fully over his face. His pupils didn't constrict. That was the moment denial broke. I threw the van into drive and pulled away faster than I should have, tires crunching over gravel, heart slamming against my ribs. In the rearview mirror, I saw him turn. Not his body, just his head, tracking me as I left. His eyes stayed on me until the curve of the exit ramp took him out of sight. I didn't stop again that night. I drove until dawn bled into the horizon, until the sky went from ink to rust to pale blue. I told myself it was nothing, a tired brain misfiring, a harmless eccentric. By the time I pulled into a proper campground near Abilene later that morning, the fear had dulled into something like embarrassment. I laughed it off while making coffee, the sound brittle in the open air. But fear has a memory. 2 days later, it caught up with me again. I was heading south this time, cutting through smaller highways toward Fort Stockton, chasing warmer weather and emptier nights. The land flattened and stretched, scrub and sky locked in a long argument. The radio faded in and out, voices dissolving into static. By late afternoon, my shoulders ached from the drive in, and that familiar fatigue crept back in, the one that whispers, just stop, anywhere is fine. The rest stop appeared without warning, a modest sign and a turnoff swallowed by mesquite. I hesitated, foot hovering over the brake. The memory of Sweetwater stirred, unpleasant but distant. I told myself I was letting a fluke dictate my choices. That wasn't who I wanted to be. I pulled in. This one was smaller, 2 picnic tables, a single bathroom building, no vending machines, no semis. The air smelled different here, drier, tinged with something sour, like old grass baked too long in the sun. I parked near the tables, engine ticking as it cooled, and scanned the lot. Empty. Relief loosened something in my chest. I got out, stretching, letting the late sun warm my face. Used the bathroom, splashed water on my cheeks, stared at my reflection longer than necessary. You're fine, I told it. You're alone. That's all. When I stepped back outside, the light had shifted. The sun dipped behind a thin veil of clouds, muting the colors. And at the far end of the lot, near the tree line I hadn't noticed before, a figure stood. Same height, same posture, same dark shirt. My stomach dropped so fast it felt like missing a step on stairs. He was farther away this time, maybe 30 yards, but there was no mistaking him. He faced me squarely, feet planted, hands at his sides. His face was harder to see at that distance, but I didn't need to see his eyes to know. He wasn't blinking. Cold slid up my spine, sharp and immediate. Suspicion curdled into dread. Coincidence, my mind insisted, clinging to logic like a life raft. People look alike. You're primed to see him now. But as I stood there, frozen between the bathroom door and my van, he took a step forward. Just one. Measured, deliberate. The gravel crunched under his shoe, loud in the quiet. He stopped again, watching, waiting. I backed toward the van, every nerve screaming. I didn't turn my back on him. I didn't run. I moved slow, controlled, like I was approaching a wild animal that might bolt or charge. My hand fumbled for the door handle, missed, found it again. As I pulled it open, I glanced away for a heartbeat, to line up my grip, to step inside. When I looked back, he was gone. No retreating footsteps, no rustle in the brush, just empty space where he'd been, the trees standing still and indifferent. The smell of sour grass hung in the air, stronger now, like something had been disturbed. I slammed the door and locked it, chest heaving. I sat there for a long time, staring at the tree line, waiting for him to reappear. He didn't. I left without eating, without resting, without understanding. By the time the third rest stop appeared on my route the following night, I was already running from something I couldn't name, and that was when the road decided to stop letting me pretend. I told myself I wouldn't stop again. I told myself the van could make it another 100 miles, 200, all the way to somewhere with lights and people and noise enough to drown out whatever had started following me. But fear makes promises the body can't keep. And by the time the fuel gauge dipped low and my hands started to cramp on the wheel, exhaustion had stripped my resolve down to bare nerve. The third rest stop wasn't even on my planned route. I took a wrong turn outside Van Horn, missed an exit I'd taken a dozen times before, and the road narrowed until it felt less like a highway and more like a suggestion. When the sign appeared, rest area 1 mile, it felt less like relief and more like a verdict. The temperature dropped fast after sunset. Cold crept up from the floorboards, numbing my feet, stiffening my fingers. The van smelled like stale coffee and old fear, a metallic tang at the back of my throat that hadn't been there before. I rolled the windows down a crack just to change the air, but the wind carried in something worse, dry, alkaline, with an undercurrent of rot, like dust layered over something that hadn't finished decomposing. The lot was long and narrow, hemmed in by scrub and low hills that swallowed the last of the light. Only 2 lamps worked, casting weak cones of yellow that didn't quite reach the ground. I pulled in slowly, heart thudding, scanning every shadow. Empty. No cars, no trucks, no figures standing too still. I parked anyway. The engine cut off, and the silence pressed in immediately, heavier than before, like the air itself had weight. I stayed in the driver's seat, keys still in my hand, listening. The van creaked as it cooled. Somewhere far off, something howled, too high for a coyote, too ragged for a dog. It rose and fell, then stopped abruptly, as if cut off mid-breath. Panic fluttered in my chest, sharp and insistent. I fought it down, forcing my breathing to slow. You're overtired, I told myself. You're connecting dots that aren't there. 2 encounters don't make a pattern. 3 would, but this was the 3rd only if I let it be. I moved to the back of the van, pulling the curtains closed with hands that wouldn't quite stop shaking. The fabric felt thinner than usual, insubstantial. I lay down fully clothed, boots still on, and eyes fixed on the dark seam where the roof met the wall. I didn't plan to sleep. I planned to wait until my pulse settled and then leave. Minutes passed, maybe more. Time stretched, warped by adrenaline. Then came the sound, not footsteps, not knocking. A soft, rhythmic pressure against the side of the van, like someone resting a palm there and leaning in. Metal sighed under the weight, a low, complaining groan. I held my breath, every muscle locked. The pressure shifted, sliding along the panel toward the rear. I told myself not to look. I told myself it was the wind, though the air outside had gone dead still. I told myself it was the van settling, though I'd lived in it long enough to know its noises, its habits. This was none of those things. The pressure stopped. Silence rushed back in, louder than before. Then, very slowly, the van rocked once, just enough to feel. My heart slammed so hard it hurt. I rolled onto my side, careful, inching toward the rear window. The curtain trembled slightly, brushing my knuckles. I hesitated, caught between terror and the need to know. The same internal fight that had followed me my whole adult life. The one that said, don't look, battling the one that said, you have to. I pulled the curtain back an inch. He stood so close I almost screamed. His face filled the window, pale and unnaturally still, breath fogging the glass in a perfect oval. His eyes were open impossibly wide, the whites stark against the dark, unblinking, unseeing, and yet seeing everything. I could make out every detail now, the faint scar cutting through his left eyebrow, the cracked skin at the corners of his mouth, the way his pupils reflected the dim light without reacting to it. He raised one hand and placed it flat against the glass. The van rocked again, harder this time. Panic finally broke loose. I scrambled forward, knocking into cabinets, fumbling for the keys, breath coming in sharp, useless gasps. The rocking stopped as abruptly as it had started. I didn't look back. I didn't check the mirrors. I jammed the key into the ignition and turned it. Nothing. The engine coughed, then died. A cold, thin sound slipped through the air outside, a laugh or something close to it. Not loud, not human. More like the idea of laughter remembered by someone who'd never learned how to make it properly. Please, I whispered, to no one, to everything. My hands shook as I tried again. The engine roared to life. I slammed the van into reverse, tires spitting gravel, then into drive, peeling out of the lot with no regard for direction or speed. The headlights swept across the rest area as I turned, and for a fraction of a second, I saw him standing exactly where I'd first parked. He hadn't chased me. He hadn't moved. He just watched me go, eyes open, unblinking, he kept reflecting the light until the road curved and swallowed him whole. I didn't slow down for an hour. When I finally did, it was because my body forced me to. I pulled onto the shoulder of a wider road, hazards blinking, and sat there shaking until dawn began to bleed into the sky. The fear didn't fade with the light. It just changed shape, settling into something heavier, more permanent. I never saw him again, but I feel him sometimes. In the way I choose where to stop now, how I trust my instincts even when they don't make sense. In the way I avoid rest stops at night no matter how tired I am. In the way silence still feels like it's watching me, waiting for me to notice. I learned something out there, crossing West Texas in February of 2023. Something the road carved into me deeper than any lesson before it. Some places aren't meant to be rested in. Some figures aren't meant to be understood. And some warnings don't come with words, just eyes that never blink, reminding you that not everything that watches wants to be seen. I still camp. I still drive. I still believe in the freedom of the road, but I don't ignore fear anymore because sometimes fear is the only thing paying attention. I thought leaving West Texas would be enough. I crossed the state line 2 days later with the windows down and the radio loud, as if sound alone could cauterize memory. New Mexico opened up in front of me. Red earth, wider sky, a horizon that felt less claustrophobic. I told myself the land had changed, and therefore whatever had happened was over. That logic felt thin even as I leaned on it. The problem with fear like that is it doesn't stay where it's born. It learns the shape of you. The first night after I left Texas, I paid for a proper RV park outside Las Cruces. Full hookups, other campers, porch lights glowing like grounded stars. I backed into the space, plugged in, went through the familiar motions with deliberate care. Normal things, safe things. Still, I slept in fragments. Every time my eyes closed, I saw him. Not moving, not advancing, just there. When I woke, my body reacted before my mind did. Heart racing, breath shallow, skin prickling as if something had leaned too close while I wasn't looking. I checked the locks twice, then a third time. Then I lay awake listening to the hum of nearby generators and the distant cough of traffic, letting noise stand guard where my courage couldn't. Morning came clean and bright, and with it, shame. I hated how small I felt, how jumpy. I'd spent years telling myself I was someone who could handle solitude, someone who understood risk and respected it without letting it rule me. Now I flinched at shadows cast by passing clouds. I felt watched in a place crowded with retirees walking dogs and sipping coffee like the world was still trustworthy. I stayed 2 nights. On the third morning, while dumping tanks and coiling hoses, an older man 2 sites down nodded at me. Friendly. Normal. "Traveling alone?" he asked. I opened my mouth to answer, then hesitated. "Yes," I said finally. The word tasted different than it used to. I kept moving after that, but something fundamental had shifted. I drove only during daylight. I planned my stops obsessively, favoring places with reviews, with photos, with evidence of human presence. I avoided rest areas entirely, even for bathroom breaks, choosing gas stations instead, no matter how run down, as long as there were people inside. And yet, there were moments, quiet, ordinary moments, when the air would change, when the temperature would drop just enough to be noticeable, when a smell would drift through the van that didn't belong. Dust and metal and that faint, sour rot. My hands would tighten on the wheel without conscious command. My eyes would flick to the mirrors. I never saw him again. But the expectation of him became its own kind of haunting. Weeks later, back in Arizona, I tried to talk myself through it like a rational man. Trauma response, acute stress, the brain's pattern-seeking turned against itself. I read articles. I listened to podcasts. I told myself stories about vigilance and survival instincts and how the mind fills gaps with monsters when it doesn't like unanswered questions. None of it explained the dreams. In them, I was always parked. Always stopped somewhere I hadn't meant to stop. Sometimes it was a rest area. Sometimes it was a dirt pull-off in the desert. Sometimes it was my own driveway, heck, the van familiar and wrong at the same time. He was never far. In the dreams, he didn't approach. He didn't touch the van. He just stood at a distance I couldn't close, eyes fixed on me, unblinking. And the terror didn't come from what he might do, but from the certainty that he'd been there long before I noticed and would be there long after I woke. I started leaving lights on at night. It was a small thing, almost embarrassing. A strip of LEDs over the kitchenette, the dash display glowing faintly, enough illumination to keep the dark from pooling too deeply inside the van. I told myself it was practical, that it helped me orient if I woke suddenly. The truth was simpler. Darkness had stopped feeling neutral. The road noticed. There's a way the environment responds when your internal balance shifts. The wind feels sharper, sounds carry farther. The absence of noise becomes suspicious. Places that once felt expansive now feel exposed, like standing under a spotlight with no idea who's watching from the seats. Somewhere outside Flagstaff, I made the mistake of pulling into a scenic overlook at dusk. I didn't plan to stay. I just wanted to stretch, to watch the sky burn itself out over the pines. The air was cold and clean, the kind that usually clears your head. Instead, it tightened my chest. As the light faded, the trees seemed to lean inward, their silhouettes blurring at the edges. The smell of sap and cold earth mixed with something else, faint, wrong. I couldn't place it at first, which made it worse. My skin prickled, the same warning ripple I'd felt before each time I saw him. I got back in the van without finishing the view. As I drove away, I realized what the smell reminded me of. The inside of an old rest area bathroom. Bleach and decay layered together. A place meant for passing through, never for staying. That's when the lesson finally settled, heavy and undeniable. It wasn't about the man. Not really. It was about what happens when you stop in places that don't care whether you exist, about how some stretches of road are just corridors, not destinations, and how mistaking one for the other leaves you exposed in ways you can't always see. The man who never blinked wasn't a predator in the way stories like to define them. He didn't chase, he didn't threaten, he didn't even speak. He witnessed. And there is something deeply unsettling about being seen without being acknowledged, about existing as an object in someone else's stillness. It strips you of narrative, of control. It reminds you that the world doesn't always interact. It observes. I adjusted my life around that understanding. I learned to listen to the first flicker of unease instead of arguing with it. I stopped romanticizing isolation. I stopped pretending that solitude was a badge of toughness instead of a state that requires respect. I started choosing rest over pride, movement over stubbornness, intuition over convenience. Most of all, I stopped stopping just because I could. Because some places aren't empty. They're occupied by the residue of everyone who passed through and never quite left, by moments suspended between arrival and departure, by watchers who don't need to move to make you feel small. I still believe in the road, in its power to strip you down and build you back up with fewer illusions. But I also believe this: if you feel watched, leave. If the silence feels attentive, don't wait to understand why. If something in you says this is not a place to rest, listen. Out there, across the long stretches of American highway, not every threat announces itself with teeth or speed. Some just stand very still, eyes open, patient enough to let you talk yourself into staying. And if you do, they'll remember you. Even now, months later, there are nights when the road goes quiet in a way that feels intentional, not peaceful, not empty, intentional. I'll be driving through a stretch of highway that looks harmless enough, reflective lines sliding under the headlights, mile markers ticking by like a slow pulse, and something inside me will tighten. No sound changes, no shape moves in the dark, but the air thickens, as if the night itself has leaned closer to listen. That's when I know I'm near a place I shouldn't stop. It took time to understand that what followed me out of West Texas wasn't fear in the simple sense. Fear fades. This didn't. This rewired. It taught my body new rules before my mind could argue. My eyes linger longer on the edges of things now. My hands don't leave the wheel as easily. I don't roll into rest areas on impulse anymore, not even during the day. Especially not during the day, because I learned something else too. The man never appeared at night first. Each time I saw him, it was in transition. Dusk, late afternoon, the hour when light pretends it isn't leaving yet, the hour when your judgment softens just enough to betray you. I went back through my route weeks later, not physically, but on maps. I traced the stops, the times, the distances. Sweetwater, south of Fort Stockton, outside Van Horn. The spacing wasn't random. It wasn't convenient. It was deliberate. Each place sat just far enough apart that exhaustion could make the choice for you. Each one existed purely for stopping, not staying. Places with no history you'd bother to learn. Places no one belonged to. Places where nobody would notice if someone stood very still for a very long time. That realization settled into me like a second spine. I started paying attention to how America really looks when you travel it this way. Not postcard America, not the curated overlooks and campground brochures, but the connective tissue in between. The margins, the pauses, the places designed to be temporary, where no one expects continuity, only passage. There's something unfinished about those places, like a sentence that never quite reaches its verb. I think that's why he fit there so well. I don't tell this story often. When I do, people want explanations. They want pathology, mental health, carbon monoxide, sleep deprivation, a drifter with an unusual effect, something they can name and shelve and feel smarter than. I let them, because the truth, Whatever it is doesn't need my defense. What matters is this. Every time I ignored my instincts, the world got quieter, not calmer, quieter, as if something was waiting to see whether I'd notice the difference. And every time I listened, every time I left instead of lingering, the road loosened its grip on me just a little. I've come to believe that some encounters aren't about harm at all. They're about recognition, about being seen at the exact moment you're most vulnerable to staying where you shouldn't, about testing whether you'll choose convenience over survival, comfort over awareness. The man who never blinked, never tried to stop me. He waited to see if I'd stop myself. That's the part that stays with me. Because if he'd chased me, if he'd knocked or shouted or threatened, it would have been easier. I could have filed him under danger avoided, story survived. But he didn't do that. He offered stillness, silence, time. He let my own fatigue and doubt do the work. And I think that's why his eyes haunt me more than anything else. They weren't angry. They weren't hungry. They were patient. Patience is terrifying when it doesn't belong to you. I've driven past those same rest stops since then. Not pulled in, never that, but past them at speed, daylight washing them flat and ordinary. Picnic tables, trash cans, faded signs, nothing to mark them as different from 100 others. But my body reacts anyway. A tightening in the chest, a subtle urge to look away, as if some part of me understands that whatever stood there once doesn't require permanence, that it could return simply by standing still again. That all it needs is someone tired enough, lonely enough, distracted enough to mistake a pause for rest. That's the lesson I carry now, heavier than any gear in the van. The road doesn't owe you safety. Silence isn't neutral, and stopping is a choice, one you make with your whole body, whether you realize it or not. I still believe in RV camping. I still believe in the strange, beautiful intimacy of living small under a wide sky. I believe in mornings that smell like coffee and cold air, in nights lit by distant towns you'll never visit. I believe in the freedom of motion, in choosing your own horizon. But I no longer believe that every place you can stop deserves you. Some places are thresholds, not shelters. Some moments are tests, not opportunities. And some figures exist only to see whether you'll listen to the quiet warning rising in your chest before your mind talks you out of it. If you ever find yourself pulling into a rest area and the silence feels attentive, if the air seems to wait instead of move, if you catch yourself hesitating for no clear reason at all, don't argue with that feeling. Don't rationalize it. Don't stay to prove something to yourself. Leave, because out there, between the lines on the map, there are watchers who don't need to follow you to know you. Watchers who never blink because they don't need to. Watchers who measure you not by how fast you run, but by whether you stop. And once they've seen you hesitate, they won't forget you.